The ocean was calm. The sun had not yet broken the horizon on the morning of October 25th, 1944. East of the Philippines, the water was a slate-gray sheet, hiding the terrors of the deep and the violence of the past 3 years of war. On the surface, a small American task unit, codenamed Taffy 3, was patrolling lazily. They were not the hunters. They were the bait. They were the sentries. They were the bottom of the barrel in terms of naval firepower. Taffy 3 was composed of jeep carriers, slow, unarmored converted merchant ships designed to hunt submarines and support ground troops, and their screen of destroyers and destroyer escorts. These escorts were known affectionately and disparagingly as tin cans. They had no armor. Their hulls were so thin a sailor could punch through some sections with a hammer if he tried hard enough. They were armed with guns that looked like toys compared to the heavy artillery of a battleship. They were never meant to fight a surface war. They were the grocery getters of the Pacific Fleet. But just over the horizon, emerging from the San Bernardino Strait, was a monster. The Japanese Center Force, the single most powerful surface fleet remaining in the Empire of Japan, had slipped through the American defenses. Led by the super-battleship Yamato, a vessel that displaced more water than the entire American task unit combined, this fleet was a hammer raised to smash the American invasion of Leyte. The Japanese Admiral, Takeo Kurita, looked through his binoculars and saw the small American ships. He likely smiled. He had caught the Americans sleeping. He had battleships against escort carriers. He had heavy cruisers against destroyers. It wasn't just a mismatch. It was an execution waiting to happen. The Japanese crews prepared to laugh as they washed the Americans into the sea. But they didn't know who they were fighting. They didn't know that on the bridge of a small destroyer called the USS Johnston, a Native American commander named Ernest Evans was about to rewrite the definition of courage. They didn't know that these tin cans were about to charge straight into the mouth of hell, armed with nothing but 5-inch guns and a refusal to die. To understand the sheer insanity of what happened that morning, you have to understand the geography of the nightmare. The United States was in the process of liberating the Philippines. Massive fleets protected the landing beaches. But through a series of miscommunications and the lure of a decoy Japanese fleet to the north, the main American heavy hitters, the fast battleships, and the heavy carriers of Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, had been drawn away. They had left the back door open, and guarding that open door was Taffy 3. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding the unit, assumed he was safe behind the main American lines. His sailors were eating breakfast. Some were drinking coffee, watching the sunrise. The mood was relaxed. The war felt far away, a distant thunder over the horizon where the Real fighting was supposed to be. Then, at 6:44 hours, a lookout on the fantail of a destroyer spotted something. Masts. Pagoda-style masts. Distinctly, terrifyingly Japanese. At first, the Americans couldn't believe it. They assumed it was Halsey's fleet returning. But then came the reports from the Combat Air Patrol. Enemy surface force sighted. The radio operators on the jeep carriers asked for verification. The pilot, screaming over the radio, replied, "I can see pagoda masts. I can see the biggest meatball flag on the biggest battleship I've ever seen." It was the Yamato. Along with her were 3 other battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. They began to open fire. The sound was unlike anything the sailors of Taffy 3 had ever heard. The Yamato's main guns were 18.1 inches in caliber. They fired shells that weighed as much as a luxury sedan. When they hit the water, they didn't just make a splash. They created geysers of dyed water, purple, green, yellow, so the Japanese gunners could spot their own fall of shot. The ocean erupted in neon-colored death. Admiral Sprague was stunned. He was facing a force that could obliterate his entire command in 10 minutes. His carriers, with a top speed of barely 18 knots, could not run. They were sitting ducks. The Japanese cruisers were faster than the American carriers could travel at full steam. Sprague did the only thing he could. He ordered his carriers to turn east into the wind to launch aircraft, and he ordered his destroyers to make smoke. The order went out to make smoke, and the destroyers began to burn oil, pumping thick, black, choking clouds into the air to hide the fleeing carriers. But smoke only hides you. It doesn't stop the shells. The Japanese radar-controlled gunfire began to straddle the carriers. It was a massacre in the making. Sprague knew he needed a miracle. He needed time. He needed someone to sacrifice themselves to slow the Japanese monster down. He didn't have to ask. On the bridge of the USS Johnston, Commander Ernest Evans watched the Japanese fleet emerge from a mist. Evans was a man cut from a different cloth. He was 3/4 Cherokee and 1/4 Creek. He had grown up poor in Oklahoma, facing prejudice and hardship, and had forged him into a warrior of immense stature. When the Johnston was commissioned, Evans had told his crew, "This is a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Nobody got off, and now Evans was going to keep his promise. Without waiting for orders, an act that in any other circumstance might be considered insubordination, Evans barked a command that stunned his bridge crew. All engines ahead flank. Left full rudder. The Johnston wasn't running away. It was turning around. It was turning directly toward the Japanese fleet. Imagine the scene. A single destroyer displacing 2,100 tons, charging alone toward a fleet displacing hundreds of thousands of tons. It was an ant charging a lawnmower. The Johnston leaped forward, her engines screaming, black smoke pouring from her stacks. She was closing the distance at nearly 35 knots, zigzagging through the pillars of water thrown up by the enemy battleships. Evans knew he couldn't win. He knew he was going to die, but he calculated that if he could get close enough within 10,000 yards, he could fire his 10 torpedoes. If he could hit a cruiser, maybe even a battleship, he might disrupt their formation. He might force them to turn. He might buy the carriers 5 minutes. The Japanese gunners couldn't believe their eyes. A lone American ship was rushing them. They leveled their secondary batteries, guns that were still larger than the Johnston's main armament, and opened fire. The Johnston was engulfed in water and shrapnel, but Evans held her steady. "Stand by for torpedo attack," he yelled. The range closed. 18,000 yards. 16,000 yards. The Johnston's 5-inch guns were firing rapidly, popping like firecrackers against the heavy armor of the Japanese cruiser Kumano. These shells couldn't penetrate the heavy armor, so Evans targeted the superstructures, the bridges, the radar systems. He was blinding them with a swarm of stinging bees. At 10,000 yards, Evans gave the order. "Fire torpedoes!" The 10 fish splashed into the water. Evans immediately whipped the ship around, retreating into his own smoke screen. Seconds later, underwater explosions rocked the ocean. The heavy cruiser Kumano, the flagship of the Japanese cruiser division, shuddered violently. A torpedo had blown her bow off. She was out of fight. The Johnston, a tin can, had just crippled a heavy cruiser. But the Japanese were not amused anymore. They were furious. As the Johnston emerged from the smoke, she was hammered. 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo tore through her deck. They smashed the engine room. They cut power to the rear gun turrets. They destroyed the gyro compass. Another 3 shells from a light cruiser struck the bridge. The bridge was a slaughterhouse. Commander Evans was blown off his feet. He lost 2 fingers on his left hand. Shrapnel embedded in his chest and face. But as the smoke cleared, the crew saw Evans pull himself up. With his hand wrapped in a bloody handkerchief, he refused medical aid. He shouted to the engine room, "Give me everything you've got." The Johnston was limping. Her speed was cut in half. She should have retreated, but Evans saw something in the distance. The other destroyers, the USS Hull and the USS Heermann, were beginning their own runs. Evans wasn't going to let them go alone. "Follow them in," Evans ordered. The Hull charged. She was targeted by the battleship Congo. The Congo's massive guns slammed the tiny destroyer. The Hull's captain, Commander Leon Kempberger, drove his ship straight at the enemy, launching torpedoes at the Congo. He missed, but he forced the massive battleship to turn sharply to evade, taking it off course and buying precious time. The Hull was smashed. Her upper works were shredded. She was sinking, but her guns kept firing until the water washed over the barrels. The Heermann, the other destroyer, engaged in perhaps the most surreal duel of the war. She found herself in a one-on-one turning fight with the battleship Haruna, a destroyer dogfighting a battleship. The Heermann was so close that the Haruna's guns couldn't depress low enough to hit her. The shells were flying over the destroyer's mast. And then there was the Johnston, the cripple. Evans, steering the ship manually from the rear steering compartment because the bridge controls were dead, saw a Japanese cruiser closing in on the escort carrier Gamber Bay. Evans maneuvered his broken ship between the carrier and the cruiser. He was drawing fire. He was acting as a physical shield, taking hits meant for the carrier. He shouted down the voice pipe to his gunners, "Fire at that cruiser! Draw a fire on us!" The Johnston was now burning furiously. She had no torpedoes left. She was running on one engine, but she was firing every gun she had. She was a zombie ship, refusing to die, biting at the ankles of giants. If the bravery of the destroyers was insane, the bravery of the destroyer escorts was impossible. These were smaller, slower, and even less armed than the Johnston. They were essentially civilian hulls with a Navy paint job and 2 guns. The USS Samuel B. Roberts, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, was one of them. Copeland got on the loudspeaker as the battle began. He told his crew, "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." The Samuel B. Roberts revved her engines to a speed she wasn't theoretically capable of reaching, 28 knots. She charged the heavy cruiser Chokai. The Sammy B., as her crew called her, got so close to the Chokai that, like the Heermann, she was under the arc of the enemy's big guns. For an hour, the Samuel B. Roberts fought a heavy cruiser at point-blank range. Her 5-inch guns fired so fast, 600 rounds in an hour, that the barrels overheated and nearly melted. The gun crews had to hose them down with water to keep them from seizing up. They shredded the Chokai's superstructure. They set her ablaze. A tiny ship, barely bigger than a yacht compared to the cruiser, was beating a heavy warship in a gun duel. But physics eventually wins. The Samuel B. Roberts was hit by 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo. The impact ripped a hole in her side 40 feet long and 10 feet high. The power went out. The ship stopped. Even then, the gunner of the aft 5-inch mount, Paul H. Carr, kept firing. When the rescue party found him later, he was dying, his intestines exposed, but he was holding a 54-pound shell in his hands, trying to load it into the breech of his destroyed gun. He begged the rescuers to help him load one last round. He died at his post. The Samuel B. Roberts sank, earning the nickname the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. While the surface ships were dying to buy time, the air above Leyte Gulf was filled with a chaotic swarm of desperate men. The planes from the Taffy 3 carriers, Wildcats, and Avengers had been launched in a panic. They were armed for anti-submarine warfare, carrying depth charges and small rockets. Some had no weapons at all. It didn't matter. They attacked anyway. Pilots flew their Avengers down the throats of the Japanese battleships. They dropped depth charges on the decks of cruisers, hoping the hydrostatic fuses would trigger. They fired .50 caliber machine guns at the heavily armored hulls of battleships, just to distract the gunners. When they ran out of ammunition, they didn't go back to land. They made dry runs. They dove at the Japanese ships, feigning torpedo drops. The Japanese captains, terrified of being hit, would wrench their massive ships into hard turns, slowing them down and spoiling their aim. One American pilot, Lieutenant Commander Ernest McFadden flew upside down over the bridge of a Japanese cruiser, buzzing the tower, so close he could see the faces of the officers. He was trying to panic them. It worked. The Japanese formation began to crumble. They were being swarmed by angry hornets that refused to go away. The Japanese gunners were overwhelmed. They were shooting at destroyers that wouldn't sink, avoiding torpedoes that weren't there, and being strafed by planes that should have been harmless. The psychological toll was mounting. Admiral Kurita, on the bridge of the Yamato, was losing the picture. He wasn't receiving good reconnaissance. He thought he was fighting the main American fleet. He thought the aggression of the Americans meant they had heavy backup just over the horizon. He couldn't conceive that a handful of escorts would fight this aggressively unless they were the vanguard of a massive trap. Back on the surface, the Johnston was entering her final moments. She was surrounded. 5 Japanese destroyers circled her like wolves around a wounded bear. They pumped shell after shell into her broken hull. Commander Evans, shirtless, covered in blood, his left hand useless, was still shouting orders. The ship was dead in the water. The engines were gone. The guns were silent. Evans gave the order to abandon ship. As the sailors scrambled into the oil-slicked water, something extraordinary happened. The Japanese destroyer Yukikes closed in to finish the Johnston off. As it passed slowly by the sinking wreck, the Japanese sailors on deck didn't cheer. They didn't jeer. They stood at attention. The captain of the Yukikes was seen on the bridge, saluting the sinking American ship. They recognized what they had just seen. They recognized the samurai spirit in their enemy. They had never seen a ship fight like that. Commander Ernest Evans was never seen again. He went down with his ship, the last of the Cherokees, having led the most gallant charge in the history of the United States Navy. By 9:20, the battle seemed lost. The Johnston was gone. The hull was gone. The Samuel B. Roberts was sinking. The carriers were taking hits. The Gamber Bay was burning and listing doomed. The Japanese fleet was closing the noose. The way to the Leyte landing beaches was open. Tens of thousands of American soldiers on the beach were defenseless against the 18-inch guns of the Yamato. And then Admiral Kurita broke. The relentless aggression of Taffy 3, the constant air attacks, the smoke, the confusion, it had all convinced him that he was walking into a trap. He believed he was fighting Admiral Halsey's heavy carriers. He believed that at any moment, hundreds of American bombers would descend on him. He issued the order, all ships turn north. On the bridge of the American carriers, the officers watched in disbelief. The Japanese fleet, on the verge of total victory, was turning away. They were retreating. "God damn it, boys," one signalman shouted. "They're getting away." But they weren't just getting away. They were fleeing the ghosts of Taffy 3. The tin cans had bluffed the most powerful fleet in the world. They had looked the Yamato in the eye and made her blink. The battle off Samar lasted only a few hours, but it remains one of the bloodiest and most heroic chapters in naval history. Taffy 3 lost 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and a destroyer escort. Over 1,000 Americans died, but they had sunk 3 heavy Japanese cruisers and damaged 3 others. More importantly, they had saved the Leyte landings. If Kurita had broken through, the slaughter on the beaches would have been unimaginable. It could have changed the course of the Pacific War. Commander Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. His citation reads, in part, "The valiant fighting spirit of the Johnston and her crew will stand as an inspiration to all who serve." Years later, historians would analyze the battle. They would look at the tonnage, the firepower, and the armor. By all metrics, Taffy 3 should have been vaporized in 10 minutes. The fact that they survived and forced a retreat is statistically impossible. It serves as a brutal, beautiful reminder. In war, it is not always the size of the gun that matters. It is the size of the heart behind it. The Japanese pilots and admirals may have laughed when they saw the tin cans that morning. But by noon, the laughter had died, drowned out by the roar of the Johnston's guns and the silence of a sea that had swallowed the arrogant and the brave alike. The Yamato would never fight a surface battle again. She was chased home, broken not by battleships, but by the ferocity of men who refused to accept that they were beaten.